Good evening. I am Ann Rauschbach, a member of County to County's Volunteer Recruitment and Engagement Team, and I want to welcome you to tonight's presentation by Professor Pope Mac McCorkle. We all know that democracy is in peril, both locally and nationally, and Professor McCorkle's groundbreaking ideas about getting out the blue vote in countrypolitan areas across our state provide a powerful strategy, not only for county to county, but for all North Carolina Democrats. One North Carolina Democrat who's worked tirelessly to enact democratic policies, not just in our district, but across the entire state, is Representative Verla Inscoe. I am honored to welcome Representative Inscoe here tonight. She will be introducing us to our presenter, Professor McCorkle, and to Representative Ricky Hurtado from Alamance County, who will be moderating the Q&A after the presentation. Thank you for being here, Verla.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my pleasure. And it is also my pleasure to introduce everyone to Mac McCorkle, one of our guests tonight. Mac's worked here in North Carolina and in 28 other states for more than 2 decades, both as a consultant to government agencies and to candidates. That's including some of our own, Mike Easley, Bev Perdue, Harvey Gantt, Erskine Bowles, and David Price. And some of you other old timers may remember when Mac was here working with some of those candidates and doing a great job. Mac's a Princeton graduate with a law degree from Duke. He clerked with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit, and then he practiced law in Raleigh with the firm that was founded by Terry Sanford, former North Carolina governor and former Duke University president. And Mac's currently now a professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. Mac's also published articles in public policy, and tonight he's going to discuss his soon to be published research on countrypolitan areas. We've all heard of metropolitan areas, and he's going to tell us all about countrypolitan areas and their importance to Democrats in the 2022 elections. And the 22 elections are really close to my heart. We have just must maintain our ability to support, sustain the governor's vetoes. That has been our power over the last 2 years. And we have stopped a lot of bad bills that we're going to go through. And so that is really a key. We also need to win some seats so we can take back the majority in 2020. And Mac has some really great ideas about countrypolitan areas in our state that will help us get to that goal. And I'm really pleased that he's going to be here with us tonight. And he will be followed, that will be followed by Ricky Hurtado, whom most of us know. Ricky's a freshman in the North Carolina House this year. He's going to be asking the questions tonight, or moderating the questions. He's also a rising star, gives great floor debates, and he also builds really good relationships with across the aisle, which is really important for our work right now. Ricky grew up in rural North Carolina. You probably know he was a son of immigrants. He saw how his parents worked, and it drove him to work really good through school. And he went to UNC Chapel Hill as a Moorhead Kane Scholar. He did his work at graduate work at Princeton, and then he worked as a consultant to nonprofits and foundations, and then was invited to join the UNC faculty as a co-executive director of an organization that works with first generation college students. And so we have really 2 stars tonight, and I'm really pleased to have both of them here tonight. And Mac, we're all eager to hear what you have to say to help us win races for the General Assembly and more. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Ann. Thank you, Verla. Thank you, County to County. I was joking with Verla that I think I met her in just a couple years ago in the Price 1986 campaign when we were both teenagers. So we go a long ways back, and Ann and I have been good friends now for a number of years. So I'm very excited to go over this with you. The study that's coming out is based on the 2020 presidential election. And of course, you could pick another election to focus on, but we thought that was the most important because, again, it was so frustrating for Democrats to come close in 2020 and not win here, where the Democrats in Georgia were able to win. And it did set the trend, even though North Carolina is a split state, Governor Cooper was able to win. We lost a lot of statewide, especially judicial races on the basis, I think, of the Trump-Biden split that stayed pretty uniform throughout from top to bottom. So I'd say that I've got three types of news based on the 2020 presidential election. I've got some different news, I've got some bad news, and then I have some good news. And the different news is that if you read the Raleigh News and Observer and other places, that most of the way that people have talked about the loss in 2020 for Biden and the Democrats was that it was a function of the so-called rural-urban divide. And in fact, there is, and we're going to go to a chart in just a second, there is a big difference between non-metropolitan or rural North Carolina and the big city counties of North Carolina. But my thesis, and I think the research shows that there's a different problem than that, a bigger problem, which is in countrypolitan counties that are in between rural and big city. And we'll go into that a little bit. But if Megan would put up the chart, we won't stay too long on this, but I think this will help. If you look real quick, again, consistent with the idea of a rural and rural-urban difference, we call it Biden's 10 bigger city metropolitan MSA counties. Those are metropolitan counties, and that contains almost every major city in North Carolina from 80,000 up, or 80, I think 83,000 up. And that's a big strength of Biden. You notice he wins 63-35 and comes smoking out of the Big Ten metropolitan counties with a very sizable lead. And then if you drop down to the blue category, the second blue category, that's the non-metropolitan. Those are 50 counties in North Carolina that the Office of Management and Budget considers to be non-metropolitan. We split them up into 25 small town counties, which means that there's a job commuting center in that county that's above 10,000. That's what the Office of Management and Budget considers. And then there's a remainder group of 25 most rural counties that are in North Carolina. And if you look at that, you'll see that Trump did very well, 61-38, when you combine those two groups into the 50 county category. But the interesting thing at looking at this is Biden's numbers coming out of the Big Ten counties way bigger, 1.5 million, whereas Trump comes out of non-metropolitan North Carolina with only 616,000 votes. So North Carolina is the 10 big city counties way more vote for Biden than Trump is given in non-metropolitan North Carolina. And you'll also notice that Biden actually had stronger support in the Big Ten counties than Trump did in the rural counties. Now, real quickly, the difference is, and why you think, oh, I've always heard that rural counties are going to be strong for non-metropolitan counties are strong for the Republicans. They are, but that's really saying that it is the white vote in those counties that is very, very strong. And in fact, there are counties in the micropolitan small town counties, as well as the most rural counties, where Black and other minority vote does cut into the white vote in a way that I think you don't usually hear about. So that explains why this area of non-metropolitan North Carolina was strong for Trump, but not as powerful in terms of overall numbers. Where you see another category, C, is 12 smaller city MSA counties. Those are metropolitan counties, according to OMB. They have a town center of 50,000 or more, and they fit that category of being metropolitan. And Trump does well in those, the same, 61-38. But that's still a small amount of vote. So when you put A, Biden's Big Ten counties, versus C, D, and E, Biden still wins North Carolina. Where he loses North Carolina is in B, 28 outlying countrypolitan counties in the bigger city MSAs. That's a lot of, I'm trying to be accurate there, but those are basically the counties in North Carolina that are next door to the bigger city counties, next door to Charlotte, Mecklenburg, places like Union, Cabarrus, Iredell. In Wake County, you can think about Johnston and Franklin are on those. So I'll just list those off because people might be interested in the 28 outlying counties. So in the Charlotte MSA, it's Cabarrus, Union, Gaston, Iredell, Rowan, Lincoln, and Anson are all in the Charlotte MSA. And Anson is one of the few Democratic places, even though it's very small. In the Raleigh MSA, those next door or adjacent counties are Johnston and Franklin. In Greensboro, it's the Greensboro MSA, it's Randolph and Rockingham. And in the Winston-Salem MSA, it's Davidson, Davies, Stokes, Yadkin. In the Durham-Chapel Hill MSA, it's Chatham, Person, and Granville. In the Asheville MSA, it's Henderson, Haywood, and Madison. In the Fayetteville MSA, it's Hoke and Harnett. Wilmington MSA, Pender County. And then Brunswick is in the Myrtle Beach MSA, and Gates, Currituck, and Camden are in the Virginia Beach metropolitan area. Now, those counties differ in many respects. Some are struggling economically, some are very small. A couple of them do still have substantial Black populations, but what is the strongest point of commonality in the countrypolitan counties is their whiteness. Unlike what you usually hear about non-metropolitan North Carolina being the whitest part of the state, the outlying countrypolitan counties are the whitest. Now, why do we call them countrypolitan? Because they are technically metropolitan by the OMB standards, but they sure don't act like the big city metropolitan counties, because there are lots of rural small town legacies in those counties. A lot of these places, the rural center in North Carolina would still consider to be rural. So how do we reflect that these are hybrid or in between kind of counties? And so we came up with countrypolitan, which is a word from country music, which reflects the change in country music from the hillbilly music to more of a pop sound in the 50s and 60s. And so I think, we're trying to reflect that, yes, there is a competing legacy going on in these counties of rural versus metropolitan, countrypolitan. But because of the whiteness of most of these counties, as you can see, look at the numbers. That's where Trump got his most votes, 934,667. His highest percentage, 63%. Biden's lowest percentage was in the countrypolitan counties. I will also note that even though Biden swept the 10 bigger city metropolitan counties, notice that Trump got 875,000 in 158 votes out of those counties. So the big vote in North Carolina is in these metropolitan areas, but we're trying to reflect that there are rural legacies that need to be taken care of. But rather than talking about these counties, especially Johnston, Union, which are big growth counties, bustling modern counties, they're very different than, for instance, the 25 most rural counties that are, especially in the East and the West, on that. So what this means in many respects, I think, is that North Carolina, let me say that this also helps explain the difference between North Carolina and Virginia and Georgia. The 10 counties immediately outlying Fulton or Atlanta have become way more racially diverse. They're also, some of them are very high college educated. And those are the counties that swept the Democrats and Biden in to Georgia, as well as those outlying counties in Northern Virginia, which again are part of the Washington, D.C. MSA, but are outlying and aren't big cities, even though they're modern suburban and exurban kind of areas. Those areas are way more racially diverse. So that's the problem that we've been struggling with actually since I've been a consultant. I worked for Harvey Gann in 1990 and wrote an article right after that and said, well, we didn't win, but we're getting close. And unfortunately, we've been staying close, but no cigar in terms of a dependable Democratic majority. Looking at these numbers, though, you can see in a good year how Democrats can win. But you can see in a not so good year why we lose, and then we especially tend to lose at the federal level, unfortunately. So the bad news here is that the demography of North Carolina does not necessarily indicate that Democrats we might be on the cusp of a dependable majority, but we're not there yet. And again, just to compare North Carolina versus Georgia, the loyal, dependable vote for the Democratic Party everywhere is the Black vote. Whether it's city, whether it's rural, Black voters are beyond loyal to the Democratic Party, even though you hear about drop-offs, and there certainly are. But in North Carolina, our Black voting population is really somewhere in the low 20s. In Georgia now, it's in the low 30s. So it's just a different ball game for Georgia, and the racial diversity of Virginia is not that different in terms of Black, but in terms of other non-white minorities is very, very strong. So the bad news is, while we're on the cusp, it is not clear at all from the numbers that Democrats are ready to take over North Carolina. And in a bad year like 2022 might be, we might have we shouldn't think that the kind of what I call the 2U coalition of urban areas and university towns is going to pull us across the finish line. Megan, we can take the screen off. I think we've done enough of the numbers. So what does this mean? Does it mean that all hope is lost? I don't think so. But what it means is we really need to get serious about strategy. And one thing that I put in the op-ed that we're working on for next week is I think it's high time for Democrats to get rid of this notion that, oh, the next election is going to prove that we're going to win and everything's just going to be finally proven. We need to realize that we're underdogs, that we have got to work our butts off, and we've really got to focus on strategy. Now, a lot of people say, well, what can we do in the countrypolitan areas? There's some good news out of the countrypolitan areas. Cabarrus, which is next door to Charlotte and is has Concord now, which is over 100,000 people. Democrats, and there's been some good work done in Cabarrus. Democrats halved Trump's margin in 2020. He only won by 9 points rather than 20 points like he won in most of the Charlotte outlying areas. If we could get that number down, the Cabarrus number, and have that in the other kind of metropolitan outlying counties around Charlotte and lose a little less, as some people say, Democrats would have a dependable majority. That would be enough if we could do that. The bad news is Cabarrus is more urbanizing. It's getting more college educated. It's got more racial diversity than a lot of those counties. And just to show you what happens in Charlotte, in the Charlotte area, Democrats come out of gangbusters out of Charlotte-Mecklenburg. Biden, that was where he got his biggest margin of the vote out of there. But that outlying area outside that countrypolitan area cut Biden's lead. Biden only won by 3.6% out of in the Charlotte MSA. Hillary Clinton lost the Charlotte MSA because of the countrypolitan effect. So that's the real problem. Can we cut into that margin in those other areas? Some people suggest, like E.J. Dion at the Washington Post has looked at the numbers and noticed that the closer in counties, say in a union, somewhat more affluent, more connected to Charlotte, more of the bedroom communities, that those might be the first to break more Democratic, maybe. But that's, again, kind of depending on demography. I've been interested to talk about how there are some areas, actually, even in some of the strongest red countrypolitan areas, there are pockets of blue support that probably need to be strengthened way more. And I'll give an example. Monroe, North Carolina, the ancestral home of Jesse Helms. And as of 2020, there was not a single Republican in local elected office in Monroe. It's the county seat of Union. Now, Union overwhelms the Monroe vote, but there had been a coalition built up, a biracial coalition in Monroe that really I don't think was very well recognized and had gotten the kind of support. So even though Biden won 6 out of the 15 precincts in Monroe, there was not the kind of turnout in Monroe, in those Monroe precincts, that you saw in Mecklenburg. It was a high turnout race. In fact, where did the share of vote, the only place that the share of vote increased in North Carolina, because it was such a high turnout everywhere, was in the red countrypolitan counties. So if we could be more supportive of a place like Monroe, that's, I think, the interesting area where there might be a lot of low-hanging fruit to focus on. Actually, the bad news is in 2021, and we were just doing this research, the city Republicans swept back in and now have a presence on the city council that they have not for many, many years. But there are other places, countrypolitan places. I don't think a lot of people realize Gastonia in Gaston County. Gaston County is a red countrypolitan area, but Gaston has a Democratic mayor and a Democratic city council. We seem not to pick this up because we think in county election results. And if you would look at Union and you looked at Gaston, you'd say, oh my gosh, those are wastelands. We can't do anything there. But there are these pockets of support. Now, this is also true for other areas in other countrypolitan areas. Hendersonville in Henderson County, Roxborough just turned a non-white and Democratic city council in the 2021 races. Even Reedsville, in the heart of Phil Berger, Rockingham, has a Democratic mayor. Focus on that. And then going beyond countrypolitan to other places, smaller MSA counties. A good example is Representative Hurtado's, part of his base, Burlington. Democratic mayor there for a number of years, just ousted in the last election, but it is a pocket of potential and potentially very strong support. And maybe Representative Hurtado would want to talk about that as well. Morganton, New Bern, Goldsboro, Sanford, Beaufort, even Albemarle in Stanley County, which is a big Republican county. These are local pockets of support. And I quote Stacey Abrams, who says, we cannot just depend on the urban areas and the university towns, as well as Reverend William Barber. We have got to expand out our vote. Now, there's a tension here, and I'll try to sum up quickly. This is not saying that focus on these areas will result in immediate flips of legislative seats. These are small pockets, but they could probably, if we had focused more on that, we might have had we probably would have had a Biden win and a number of other statewide wins. And what I think that we need to be focused on is something more fundamental. We need big turnout from these areas, but I think we probably need to start thinking about strengthening the democratic political culture and expanding out from these bases. So it's not just an election year, oh, let's go get the vote there. It's about really helping the people who are Democrats and independents in these areas. And again, a lot of these areas have some very interesting multiracial coalitions. So that's the good news. 2022 is going to be a tough time. But I think if we give up on this notion that we're going to win just because of demography, and really start focusing on where our weaknesses are and potential strengths, especially in the countrypolitan areas, but across North Carolina, then I think, at least for the future, we're building a future where we might be able to really establish what I call a dependable Democratic majority, one where we can win most statewide races and start winning at the legislative level. And then I'll just end with this thought, the legislative level. One thing that's of great concern is that even though the Republicans are becoming very nefarious about their gerrymandering, no question about that, because our vote is so concentrated now, we're almost sitting ducks in many respects for their gerrymandering tricks on us. And that's a real concern. So again, we don't want to support what the Republicans are doing. I hope the State Supreme Court will overturn that. But we do have a problem beyond gerrymandering, which is our vote is way too concentrated in the urban and university areas. And again, over time, the only way we're going to really be able to think about a strong Democratic legislature and congressional delegation is if we start, I think, to fundamentally focus on some of these pockets of support outside the urban and areas and university towns. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mac. That's great information that we can all use. We certainly can use. Now, Ricky, would you like to moderate the Q&A? I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Yeah, of course, Mac. Thanks so much for that really thorough presentation. I want to jump in with just like a few comments before I moderated the Q&A, if that's all right. I think you're right. We saw a lot of what you're describing here in Alamance County. I loved reading your paper. I felt like I was in grad school again, highlighting everything, you know. But what I loved about it is that a lot of my life I've spent in the places that you're describing. So I grew up in Sanford. I represent Alamance County now. I actually just did a trip out to Morganton and Burke County, and a few years ago was in Union County in Monroe, actually. And so there's quite a narrative there that we can really unpack and continue talking beyond the data. But you're right. I think this 2022 is, you know, to nobody's surprise, will be a difficult year, but at the same time, there's a lot of ways that we can define wins and continue building towards those big wins that we want to see in North Carolina. And so we have to take every year seriously. And that's why I'm so excited that there's 72 people on this call in January of 2022. So I want to thank all the C2C volunteers here that are fired up and ready to go alongside us to think about how we build the future we want in North Carolina. I'll jump in right here into Q&A, but I'll actually start with one of my questions first. Because there's a lot to dig into here. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, and I don't know how much you follow these trends in terms of demographics, but do you see this colliding sort of the trends in where people are moving from urban to more suburban areas in North Carolina and these countrypolitan counties? Sort of like, is there a collision with sort of pandemic politics, right? A lot of people are working from home now, probably maybe moved to Union County, maybe moved to Cabarrus versus Mecklenburg. Do you feel like that might be a trend that is supportive of sort of the, I guess, focusing on some of these blue pockets?
Yes. I mean, we cite that in some of that literature in the footnotes of the longer paper. Actually, this is actually a trend, Ricky, that started, as you know, before the pandemic. And there is some hope that blue millennials who, as they age, may want to move to areas outside that they won't be just urban cats all the time. And that would be very good for the Democrats. Whether that would fundamentally change for 2022, probably not. But that is a hope, a demographic hope, that the unions, even the Johnstons, that people would move, more liberal people. And there's some interesting work by Jed Coco, an economist who's looked at that and suggested that there might be a collision of blue and red in some of these areas. So long range, there is some hope on that. Again, I'm trying to focus more immediately on strategy and not hoping for that change, but I think that's a real possibility.
No, that's great. That's great. Life's not bad out here. So as a millennial, maybe we need to start a PSA to move out to these countrypolitan counties, right?
Well, you are a great example of what I'm thinking about. So
well, that's a different campaign we can plan on later.
Yeah.
But I had a follow-up question around demographics. I cited the towns that I did because something that I noticed in all of those places, and you started touching on this, is the growing Latino or Latinx community in these places. I think of Monroe, I think of Morganton, I think of Sanford, 1 in 5, and I think of Burlington as well. What do you see as the potential of opportunity there to really deepen our multiracial coalition as Democrats start winning races?
Well, the good news there is, and again, I've been asking demographers, I'm not a demographer, but at some point, the Latino voting population is going to catch up with the larger population. And we should see, explosions may be too strong a word, but a greater presence, voting presence that could help Democrats. The problem, the dilemma is that I feel like I hope we're not taking that for granted, because there is a different political culture there than the African-American Black culture, which again has been so incredibly loyal to the Democratic Party. And if we take that vote for granted, if we just say, oh, well, that's another non-white minority, put them in the box, we got them, Democrats got them, that could be very scary. So again, I think that goes to the larger point of not just thinking about areas for turnout, but how could we get a Ricky Hurtado running in Union County, either for local office at the beginning. I don't think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but even when the coalition was strong in Monroe until this past year, I don't know that they had a Latino representative. So that's the kind of thing we need to think about in terms of strategy. The demographics make it possible, but I'm worried we're taking that vote for granted, so to speak.
Yeah, I love talking about Union County because it represents so many things, so many pockets of opportunity in North Carolina. One is, folks don't know, right? But in 2020, when I was running, I think the only other Latino candidate that was running, it was not a competitive race, at least like numbers wise, was in Union County, which I think is a signal in terms of what you described as the political culture, right? Of people becoming more interested in getting involved politically. One more sort of small story about Union County that I love is you referenced Jesse Helms, obviously, when talking about Union County and Monroe. When I was down there a few years ago, I remember driving by a park that was called Jesse Helms Park. It was a big soccer field, and there's probably about 50, 60 young Latino kids playing soccer on there. And I'm like, look at that, right? And I had to laugh, right? Because it just, I couldn't get a picture of it, but you just had to laugh. And
that's great. That's perfect. In fact,
that represents everything of Union County, North Carolina, right? In terms of demographic shifts and where a place like Union County could be headed, right?
Yeah. And we go on to other questions. The other fascinating thing about Union County is, I said it was the ancestral home of Jesse Helms. It also was the home of Robert P. Williams, an NAACP leader who really, before Stokely Carmichael and before all the university types started talking about Black Power, was kind of an indigenous homespun form of Black Power. So Monroe, it's the ancestral home of Jesse Helms, but it's kind of a powder keg too, in many respects. It could change. And again, maybe we'll find out that demography does just make these places change. I think they are changing, but I feel like Democrats, we need a bigger push there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One more question in terms of the numbers. I don't know if you've dug into this. I didn't necessarily see it in your paper unless I missed it, but I wonder if you've done other work around it. The places that you've mentioned, the 28 countrypolitan counties, areas, you talk about blue pockets, but did you also look at perhaps registered Democrats that didn't vote in 2020, or folks, or the potential to register more folks there? Do you have any sense of what that opportunity is?
No, I haven't done detail because again, that that would be very laborious, and maybe that would be a next step. But it's very interesting. Like I said, we were able to look at the Monroe precincts that Biden won. So these are, and the turnout there is very low in a high turnout race. So you would think registration, even though in some registered voters who were not picked up, you even go to a small place like Anson, where again, that is an area of Democratic support, but there's real suggestion in the numbers that we can pick up, we should be able to register more voters and get more registered voters who are at least open to a Democratic message there. But I haven't done that kind of detail work.
That's my suspicion, right? And I asked
that's mine too.
A year ago, after I won my election, I was curious here in Alamance because I won in a essentially 50-50 race in Alamance County. It's a red county overall, and we saw all of our county commissioner candidates lose by a fairly significant margin, bigger than we anticipated. So we started crunching the numbers and quick back of the envelope estimates. We started having the conversation as people who care about our community around the persuasion versus turnout conversation that all Democrats are having. And we looked at the numbers, and there was anywhere between 5,000 to 10,000 either folks that were registered as Democrats but didn't vote, or that were potential targets to register to vote in Alamance County alone. And that, you register, even a small portion of that, then it becomes a 50-50 race in many places in the county. And so it'd be curious to sort of look at places like Cabarrus and Union and Franklin and all the counties you've cited to sort of think about what are other sort of implications that the data sort of
and it may be based on some work by the Knight Foundation and then Jacobin Magazine that some of the people who share the same demographics that seem to be progressive demographics, they might be more ideologically unorthodox or heterodox, and might be a little harder to get them out than we've been thinking. And they might not be, again, consistently progressive, but what's clear is they're not consistently conservative, and they're open to a kind of message that I think you were very successful in being able to do. Can I ask you, Ricky, how much of Guilford was in your district?
It's all, our county grouping is all Alamance County. So I have like essentially the northeastern corner of the county. So actually the part closer to Orange County.
Oh, okay. So you had no Guilford in your district?
No Guilford, no. Don't even the border to Guilford.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have another question here. Mark is asking this question in the chat, and I think it's a question that everyone on this conversation is having, or else it wouldn't be here, right? You talk about the urgency and wanting to sort of create some urgency, especially for Democrats in the short term, around what this means for us and what are the strategic decisions we have to make. And so Mark asked, what are the implications in terms of where resources should be deployed in terms of fundraising, door knocking, phone banking? If you were on the phone with Beasley right now, right? What are you thinking about, right? When you look at this data and you're writing this paper?
Well, for Beasley, I mean, I think it shows, and I think Jeff Jackson actually picked up on some of this, the 100 counties. That's an old Terry Sanford, my mentor, used to talk about that. And I think it's important to do it regardless of the strategic value. But I think it does give a roadmap, and I've sent it to Beasley people, previous drafts, of, again, the need to get outside. We've got to have big turnout in the urban areas. We've got to have big turnout in the university towns. But getting these kind of areas that you and I have been talking about, it's really important that I think Beasley not depend on that, because again, in 2022, this isn't a particular area, in a particularly good year to just be depending on our constant base. I'm, though, wanting to say two things. I really want to hear from people on the ground based on this analysis what to do. I'm not, I haven't been involved in the ground game in a long, long time. But my main point is, I think we can't just view it as turnout. There's got to be some building of fundamental political cultures in these particular areas. Second, there's a tension here that I should admit, and because I don't want to sound like I've been criticizing my successors too much at the Democratic level. If your goal is simply to immediately flip the legislature, which we have been focused on, then the strategy of focusing on some of these areas is not going to pay off. This is more of a statewide strategy at first. It will not pay off immediately, but I think pays off in the larger areas. So I'm willing to have that debate with people who say, well, these areas are good for the future, but we maybe can't focus on them because we want to get legislative. We want to focus on legislative races. We're not going to win. I don't think we'll win, for instance, Union County anytime soon. So that's the tension that I want to admit. I'm having a statewide focus, which I think ultimately will help at the legislative level. But some of our problem has been that we've been understandably kind of focused only at the legislative level. And so some of these areas just get forgotten because they're in strongly red areas.
Yeah, but I will say, I mean, you have a point there, but I also will say that in a lot of the counties that you've cited, there is quite a bit of overlap with some of the more competitive state legislative races, right? You look at Franklin County, and that's part of Senator Sarah Crawford's district. I look at Cabarrus. Dr. Amy Steele just ran really competitive races.
Cabarrus is a really good example.
And so I do think of us, and obviously I'm biased since I'm in this race and love county to county support, right? But in many ways, the state legislative races are sort of for the front lines. We are the foot soldiers of so many other races. And I don't know how much you've dug into sort of reverse coattails, right? But when I was knocking on doors or phone banking, so much of what I heard, and it's part of this building this culture of engagement in our communities, is, wow, I've never really had a candidate reach out and talk to me, right? Or you actually want to know what I have to say, and that happened more often than I wanted to. And we're not exactly in the middle of nowhere. We're not like small town North Carolina, right? And so if that's the case here, what does that mean in Union County, where Democrats really don't have a hope of winning a legislative race in the next cycle or two or three, right? What does that look like for building that culture?
I think your race really does reflect that this kind of strategy could work at the legislative level, but I understand why there was reservation, about your race saying, oh, young Latino in Alamance County, that ain't going to work. I think it will, but I think it is fair. I don't want to sound like I'm just critical of people of the lack of focus. I think there was a rationale there, but the rationale is getting thinner and thinner.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's dig into some of these other questions here. Kay had a question here around comparing, and you dug into some of this, but maybe you can go into a little deeper, comparing North Carolina to Virginia, right? I think that we're a bit shaken with what happened at the end of 2021 with the results in Virginia. And she said, can you relate what you're saying to the results of the Virginia's governor's race, in which VA Dems depended on Nova and ignored red Southwestern Virginia, where young and big?
Virginia, well, yes, and again, we have that in the larger paper, and I want to dig more into Virginia. But two things. One, obviously, Youngkin was able to cut in half, in many respects, the margin in Northern Virginia that McAuliffe was depending on, which is bad, even though McAuliffe still won Northern Virginia. Those outlying counties in Virginia are still, Loudoun County, for instance, Fairfax, they're still Democratic counties, unlike the counties outlying Charlotte, so still a big difference. My fear is, and I have not done the work on Virginia, and there's a big debate going on that I'm trying to follow, is that you may have also seen in Virginia in 2021 what we didn't see in North Carolina in 2020, which is a more significant increase in the non-metropolitan vote and a more significant increase in the Republican margin there, so that we might have been hit by a situation where we didn't do as well in Nova as we did in 2020, and the so-called rural or non-metropolitan vote in Virginia kicked in to be even stronger. It was not that strong in North Carolina in 2016 and 2020. It was still powerful, but not as strong. But I think that could be the real bad news from Virginia. And of course, if that happens in North Carolina in 2022, our challenge is even tougher.
No, thanks for sharing that. Marilyn Carter, hi Marilyn, had a question. Wanted to actually ask you to expand more on Reidsville and Rockingham. I know we focus on a handful of counties here, but you cited 28 and we've only talked about 5. So do you want to talk a little bit about Reidsville and Rockingham?
Yeah, and you know, I worked for Sandy Sands, who was a state legislator from Reidsville back in the day. And I don't want to act like, again, I'm an on-the-ground expert of these areas, but Reidsville's an interesting situation. There's now an African-American mayor, longtime Reidsville native. But before that, Jay Donaker was a registered Democrat and progressive as well in many respects. He got involved in the gerrymandering issue and a number of other things. I don't want to suggest that a Reidsville is some liberal haven. What I'm suggesting, though, is the Black and some white vote there that has stayed loyal to the Democratic Party simply gets overlooked. So if somebody can win as a registered Democrat as a mayor in Reidsville, that interests me as could we build on that foundation and expand out from that foundation. Again, not to turn Rockingham Democratic anytime soon, but to cut into the Republican margin could be very, very important in statewide races.
No, that's great. Let's see what other questions we have here from folks. If not, I have a few more I wanted to ask you. Also, just a quick aside to the CTC folks. We've been talking about some of these blue pockets in otherwise red districts. And I believe someone, maybe you, Mac, cited Roxborough and how the city council just flipped.
Yep.
And so if y'all are interested in hearing more about that, I think it's a good case study of good Democratic leadership on the ground. Anderson Clayton is doing.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say there are a few other questions in the chat if you want me to read them out to you.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I'm
One,
people-
that here.
no, totally okay. One is probably something that's top of mind for a lot of us right now. It's, can you address the recent judicial decisions on NC maps and how that affects things?
Well, now I'm going to sound more like a Democrat than an analyst, I guess. I'm still thinking that that's just the first decision. We'll see what the Supreme Court decides. It's a tenuous majority that Democrats have, but my sense as a lawyer of the odd way that the 3-judge court appointed by Justice Newby, so kind of set up for the Republicans, that there's a lot in that opinion that seems to signal great distaste for what the Republicans did, and then throwing up their hands saying we can't do anything about it. So I'm still cautiously optimistic that we could have the state Supreme Court throw out the maps. Now, the counter news to that is what concerns me still is, again, as I said before, how concentrated our vote is, that the Republicans might be able, they're not going to probably be able to get away with 11-3 in the congressional delegation. I'll just talk about the congressional delegation, or 10-4. But they might find a way that courts would accept 9-5, given some of the simulations and the runs that these experts, even on the Democratic side, have done. And that again goes to this larger point, I think, of our vote is too concentrated and how we need to set up more foundational support outside the urban areas and university towns for Democratic candidates.
Thanks for sharing that, Mac. Adrian, did you have any more questions you wanted to?
Yeah, I'm going to combine a couple together because they're kind of about the same thing. So it's more about like, how does this look if we look at population growth? Like what's driving the demographic shifts for different minorities, like the Latinx vote and things like that? Like how are they shifting and how could they potentially play a bigger role?
Well, one thing that, again, Democrats have been, I think, a little too seduced by, and because you see it in the journalists, a lot of the journalistic takes, is, oh, North Carolina is becoming more diverse and the metro areas, the big city areas are drawing more people. Actually, the biggest percentage growth, at least percentage growth, is a lot in these red countrypolitan areas. Now, Ricky and I've also already talked about the possibility that maybe that means that they might turn more blue over time. But I think the demographic story is way more of a mixed one than we've been led to believe. There's certainly good trends for Democrats, but one way that I put it in my paper is back in the late 1940s, John Gunther wrote a book on the United States and did all the states. Talked about North Carolina being the most all-American state in the nation because it was so homegrown and indigenous and there wasn't much migration into North Carolina. After all the migration we've had, where are we still with? Phil Berger and Speaker Moore and 2 Republican senators. So there's been a lot of demographic change, but I think relying on the demography is a problem. The demography creates the possibility and the opportunities for us, but does not mean that it's going to win for us.
No, that's such a great point. And I think that's actually a great point to start wrapping up the conversation here. If it's something that I've grappled with over the last few years, is that demographics are not destiny in any sense of the word, especially here in North Carolina. And I think the work that C2C is doing is what we should be doing, right? I mean, it's quite literally in the mission statement of the organization as you partner with other counties. I mean, I certainly would not have won my race here in Alamance County. We can use that as a case study of how we replicate those sorts of partnerships. In the long term, yes, I agree with a lot of you that we need to build the civic infrastructure of these communities so we can continue building up volunteer bases and organizations that are really invested in places. But in the short term as well, like we need help, y'all. And so I'm so glad that right now there's like 69 folks on here listening to this conversation, making the resolutions if you haven't already for 2022. I hope you all commit to one of the canvases or phone banks or lit drops or whatever C2C is doing this year. Not just for Alamance County, although all of y'all are welcome anytime here to support Next Door, but with all the other communities that you're partnering with to make sure that we're doing our part, both for the big prizes of 2022, right? A Senate race and to hold the line for the legislature, but also for these small W wins, right? Like we're continuing to build infrastructure and power in all these communities to make sure that 2023 and 2024 is a little easier and not just wait for those big races to begin investing in these communities. And so really grateful for all of y'all's time to have this conversation. I'm sure all of you want Mac's paper now. It was a quick read, although when I downloaded it, it said 39 pages. It was faster than 39 pages, Mac. So
what I've done real quickly for people, I've got a 2-page summary, and then I go for 10 pages into detail. And then for the nerds and scholars, I've got about 20 pages of footnotes just to shut them up. But you see different levels of the paper on that. And I want to just second Ricky's motion in toto. I think that his statement about the importance of county to county just cannot be ignored.
Absolutely, absolutely. So thanks y'all for this really great conversation and questions. Mac, thank you so much for your time and for your work. And I'd love to toss it over back to Verla to close us out here. I think you're still on mute, Verla.
So I would just join in saying thank you to everyone for coming. Had a really great turnout tonight, and thanks to Mac and Ricky for their role, and a lot of information here, and a lot of opportunities that we can take advantage of. I want to just think about what is it that drives you to be here tonight, and drives you to be engaged like this. And you know, for me, I think it is that probably my background. My father was in the Second World War, followed the troops. He was a medic, and he followed the troops from Normandy to Paris. And so we got a letter from him one time. My mother said that we've got his war letters that are blackened out in places where he said things he couldn't say. But one letter said, "I can hear the big guns." And when he got home, he said that he was really right at the front lines. And so a lot of people, I think, have over the years, not just the Second World War, but through our existence, have really risen to the time that was needed and for our sake. And we have generations coming behind us that also want and need and deserve the privilege of living in a democracy where the people have a role in how we're governed, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It is really a gift to the world, and this is our Normandy. I say, you know, this is our time to really step up and pull new people in and stay healthy. It's really important to you know, monitor your workload and get some play work into. So, but I know we have a really some challenging times coming up, but I'm very confident that there are people, plenty of people who are feeling the same way I am, and that this is really an important race. We've got to keep the word going, and I think we've got a really good start. This is wonderful to have this many people this early in the year coming out to be active. There are a lot of more people out there we can activate. And I think that as we see the races developing and emerging and more people are getting involved, that we need to make sure that we keep some of those other people that are working maybe for individual candidates and getting them to come into C2C. C2C is a real gift to the North Carolina Democratic Party. And you're doing really wonderful work all across the state. People know what you're doing. And I hope that we can build some more organizations like yours in other counties too. And again, thanks to all of you for being here, and forward together, not one step back. So thank you very much, and have a good night. We'll see you again soon.
As Representative Insko has indicated, C2C can utilize this information. We can use it to get out the vote in 2022. So in closing, we'd like to thank Representative Hurtado for adding to our appreciation of Professor McCorkle's research with his insightful questions. And many thanks to Professor McCorkle for enlightening us with his research and analysis of country politics in areas of our state that will help guide C2C with their strategies for 2022. Finally, we'd all like to express our gratitude to Representative Insko for her invaluable public service to not just our district, but the entire state. You're a treasured stateswoman, Verla, and you will be greatly missed when you retire. So, with Republicans poised to regain a veto-proof majority in the General Assembly and enact policies that would limit our access to the ballot box, limit women's reproductive rights, and limit our right to peaceful protest, C2C needs an energetic volunteer force. We must protect our Democratic incumbents and elect other Democrats to the General Assembly. We need you. So go to countytocountync.org, click on volunteer, and then click on join a team. This is what you'll see on the website. So let's all get out to work to save our state. Thank you and stay safe. Good night.